Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into art therapy today, a fascinating field. It's amazing just how versatile art therapy is as a tool. It's used by all sorts of professionals to help people in a bunch of different ways. And today, we'll explore the breadth of those applications.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, the learner who wants to grasp new ideas quickly and thoroughly, this deep dive is designed for you. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, extracting the core insights in a way that's hopefully clear and engaging for you.
Our guide for this journey is the Handbook of Art Therapy, a foundational text in the field. It's a really comprehensive handbook that covers everything from the history and theoretical approaches of art therapy to the assessment methods and clinical applications across different populations.
So yeah, it's really the roadmap to this field. And our goal today is to pull out the most important pieces to give you, the listener, a solid understanding of this.
So our mission today is simple. By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a clear picture of what art therapy is, how it's used in practice, and why it can be such an effective therapeutic modality. Okay, let's unpack this. Art therapy, well, it's not just about analyzing someone's artwork like it's some Rorschach test, right?
Right.
It's a whole field with a history and a whole set of pretty interesting ideas behind it.
Yeah. It's more than just interpreting pictures.
Right.
It actually has a rich history and a really compelling theoretical basis.
So where do we even begin with the history of art therapy? I mean, it feels like people probably used art for healing purposes throughout history.
You're absolutely right. But when we talk about the formal field of art therapy, it really began to take shape in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
And there were a few key thinkers who really helped shape the field into what we know it as today. One standout figure is Margaret Naumburg. She's often referred to as the mother of art therapy.
Okay, so who was Margaret Naumburg and what were some of her big contributions to the field?
Well, Naumburg was a real pioneer. She was actually an educator and a therapist who worked in schools and mental health settings, advocating for the use of art as a way for children to express themselves and work through emotional issues. And what's really interesting is that her work was heavily influenced by psychoanalysis, particularly the ideas of Freud and Jung, which were very popular at the time. She was really interested in the unconscious mind and how art could provide a window into that hidden realm.
So that sounds a lot like the psychodynamic approach to therapy where you're really focused on those unconscious processes, right?
Exactly. And through her work, Naumburg developed what she called dynamically oriented art therapy, which basically viewed art as a direct symbolic language of the unconscious. This was a pretty radical idea at the time. Instead of just seeing art as a byproduct of therapy or a nice activity to do, she saw it as a primary way for people to communicate their deepest, most hidden thoughts and feelings, things that they might not even be aware of on a conscious level.
Right, so it's like the art itself becomes a form of communication, almost like a language that can bypass those conscious barriers.
Exactly. And the therapist can help the client understand what those symbols and images might represent, and that can lead to some really profound insights and breakthroughs.
So I'm guessing Naumburg's ideas were pretty influential in shaping the early days of art therapy.
Oh, absolutely. Her emphasis on the unconscious and the symbolic nature of art really laid the groundwork for a lot of the theoretical approaches that followed. And, even though art therapy has evolved a lot since then, those early psychodynamic ideas from Freud, Jung, and other thinkers are still very much present in how many art therapists understand their work today.
It's amazing how those ideas continue to resonate. So in a way, Naumburg's work was really a bridge between traditional psychoanalysis and this newer field of art therapy.
Exactly. She helped create a space where those ideas could be explored in a new and creative way, using art as the primary mode of communication.
So we talked about the unconscious mind and symbolism being important in this approach. But I'm curious, how exactly does that play out in therapy? Is it all about letting clients freely express whatever comes to mind through their art, or is there more structure to it?
Well, there's definitely a range of approaches within art therapy. Some therapists, even those who lean towards psychodynamic theory, find that more structured activities can be just as revealing about what's happening beneath the surface.
Okay, so what would that look like in practice?
You might be familiar with those classic projective tests like the draw person test or the house tree person test. These involve giving the client a specific instruction like draw a house and then seeing how they interpret that instruction. Even though there's a specific prompt, there's still a lot of room for individual expression. It's not like a paint by numbers activity.
So what kinds of things might the therapist be looking at in those drawings?
It could be anything from the way the person uses color and space to the size and placement of the objects, to the overall mood or feeling that the drawing evokes. These details can offer clues about the person's emotional state, their relationships with others, and their unconscious conflicts. And again, all of this is viewed through the lens of those psychodynamic ideas, looking for symbols and patterns that might reveal something about the person's inner world.
I see. So it's not just about the content of the drawing itself, but also how the person approaches the task and the subtle choices they make along the way.
Right. It's about understanding the process as much as the product. And sometimes those more structured activities can actually be more helpful in getting people to open up, especially if they're feeling hesitant or self-conscious about their artistic abilities.
That makes sense. It's like it gives them a starting point, something to work with, which can make it feel less daunting.
Exactly. And the therapist is there to guide them through the process, to help them make sense of what they're creating and what it might mean for them.
So we've talked about the influence of psychodynamic approaches on art therapy, but I'm guessing there are other psychological theories that have shaped the field as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Art therapy is really interesting because it's not confined to just one school of thought. It actually integrates principles and techniques from a variety of different psychological approaches, and we'll dig into those now.
Okay, so what are some of those other major theoretical approaches that are used in art therapy?
Well, one that comes to mind is the humanistic approach. This is all about focusing on the individual's potential for growth and self-actualization, as well as their unique experiences and perspectives.
I've heard of humanistic psychology. It's all about things like self-acceptance and personal growth, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And in humanistic art therapy, the focus is on empowering the individual to express themselves creatively and to explore their own inner world through art. It's not so much about interpreting symbols or digging into the unconscious. Instead, it's about creating a safe and supportive space for the client to tap into their own creativity and to discover their own meanings and insights through the art-making process.
So in humanistic art therapy, is the emphasis more on the creative process itself rather than analyzing the artwork for hidden meanings?
Right. The art is seen as a way for the person to connect with their authentic self, to explore their emotions and experiences, and to discover new ways of being in the world.
So would you say there's less emphasis on interpretation in humanistic art therapy compared to the psychodynamic approach?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's less about the therapist trying to decipher hidden meanings and more about supporting the client's own self-discovery through their art. There's this idea that the act of creating something, regardless of what it looks like, can be incredibly therapeutic in and of itself.
I can see how that would be empowering. It's like you're giving the client the tools to express themselves and find their own meaning rather than telling them what their art means.
Exactly. And a key aspect of the humanistic approach is that it emphasizes choice and personal responsibility. There's a great example in the handbook where an art therapist named Bruce was working with a client, Rob, who was going through a really difficult time and kept using only black paint in his artwork.
I can see how that might concern a therapist.
Yeah, it would be easy to jump to conclusions about what that meant, right? But instead of doing that, Bruce took a really humanistic approach. He gently pointed out to Rob that he was choosing to use black even though other colors were available.
Oh, that's interesting.
It seems like such a small thing, but it really highlights Rob's ability to make decisions, even in the midst of his struggles. It wasn't that he couldn't use other colors, he was making a conscious choice. And that realization can be really powerful for someone who might be feeling lost or overwhelmed.
I see. So by pointing out the choice, the therapist helped Rob see his own agency in the situation.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be a real turning point in therapy.
So it's like instead of focusing on the darkness of the black paint, the therapist focused on the act of choosing, the power that Rob had in that moment.
That's a great way to put it. And that's a really good illustration of how the humanistic approach plays out in art therapy.
So we've talked about psychodynamic approaches
Yep.
and humanistic approaches. What are some other big theories that inform art therapy?
Another really important one is the cognitive behavioral approach. Now, you might be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which has become really popular in recent years.
Yeah, I've heard of it. It's all about how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are connected, right?
Exactly. And cognitive behavioral art therapy takes those same principles and applies them to the art-making process.
So how does that actually work? How do you use art to address those cognitive and behavioral patterns?
Well, the core idea is that By externalizing problems through art, people can get a more concrete visual representation of what they're struggling with. It's like taking those thoughts and feelings that are swirling around in your head and putting them out there in a way that you can actually see and interact with.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of just thinking about a problem abstractly, you're giving it a physical form through art.
Exactly. And once you have that visual representation, you can start to explore it in a different way. You can look for patterns, identify triggers, and even experiment with new ways of thinking and behaving, all within the context of the artwork.
I see. So the artwork becomes a tool for understanding and changing those cognitive and behavioral patterns.
Exactly. The handbook gave a really good example of this. They talked about a client who was struggling with negative self-talk and body image issues. The therapist had her draw out her negative thoughts, and she actually drew herself as a desexualized homemaker, which is a pretty powerful image.
Wow, that is powerful.
Right. And by creating that image, she was able to step outside of those thoughts and feelings and start to look at them in a more objective way. She could see how distorted they were, how they weren't really reflecting who she was. And that realization was a huge step forward for her in therapy.
That's a great example of how art can make those abstract thoughts and feelings more tangible and accessible.
Absolutely. And another technique that's often used in cognitive behavioral art therapy is something called cognitive restructuring. This involves helping the client identify and challenge their negative thought patterns and replace them with more positive and realistic ones.
So it's about literally rewiring those thought patterns. And I'm guessing art can play a role in that process.
Right. The therapist might ask the client to create an image that represents their negative thought and then to transform that image in some way to reflect a more positive or balanced perspective.
So it's like they're literally transforming their thoughts through the art-making process.
That's the ideal. It's a way of making those internal shifts more concrete and actionable.
Okay, so we've talked about psychodynamic, humanistic, and cognitive behavioral approaches. Are there any other big theoretical frameworks that are commonly used in art therapy?
Another one that comes to mind is the solution-focused approach.
I'm not as familiar with that one. Can you explain a bit more about what that entails?
Sure. The solution-focused approach, as the name suggests, is really all about finding solutions rather than dwelling on problems. It's a very present and future-oriented approach, and it emphasizes collaboration between the therapist and the client.
So it's less about digging into the past and more about figuring out what works moving forward.
Exactly. And art therapy fits in really well with this approach because it can be a less intimidating way to explore problems and brainstorm solutions.
I see. So how would that work in practice?
Well, for example, imagine you're working with a family who's having a lot of conflict. Instead of having them sit and talk about their problems, which might just lead to more arguing, you could have each family member draw a picture of what they think the main problem is.
Oh, that's a clever idea. So they're each getting their perspective out there, but in a way that's not as confrontational as just talking about it.
Exactly. And then you can have them share their drawings and talk about what they see, which can lead to a more productive conversation about how to move forward.
It's like the art becomes a bridge for communication, a way for them to see each other's perspectives more clearly.
Right. And it can also help to shift the focus from blaming each other to working together to find solutions.
So it sounds like the solution-focused approach is really about empowering the client to find their own answers, with the therapist acting more as a guide and facilitator.
That's a great way to put it. And the use of art can be really helpful in that process, especially for people who might be resistant to traditional talk therapy or who find it hard to articulate their thoughts and feelings verbally.
Okay, so we've covered psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive behavioral, and solution-focused approaches. I feel like we're getting a really good sense of the breadth of theoretical frameworks that inform art therapy. Are there any other key approaches we should know about?
There are. And one that's especially relevant when working with children and adolescents is developmental art therapy.
Okay, tell me more about that one.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in how art therapy is used with kids.
Well, developmental art therapy takes into account the different stages of artistic and cognitive development that children go through, from early scribbling to more representational drawing and beyond. It's based on the work of people like Victor Lowenfeld and Jean Piaget, who were really influential in our understanding of child development.
Right, those are big names in developmental psychology.
Exactly. And by understanding these developmental stages, the art therapist can choose activities and materials that are appropriate for the child's age and level of development.
I see. So it's about meeting the child where they're at developmentally.
Right. And it's not just about the child's artistic skills, it's also about their cognitive and emotional development. For example, a young child might not be able to express their feelings verbally, but they can express them through their art.
So the art becomes a way for them to communicate what they might not be able to say with words.
Exactly. And the art therapist can help the child understand their own feelings and learn how to cope with them in healthy ways.
So developmental art therapy is all about using art to support the child's overall growth and development.
Right. And it's not just for children with specific diagnoses or problems. It can also be a really valuable tool for supporting healthy development in all children.
So I'm guessing it's also used with children who have experienced trauma or who have developmental delays.
Absolutely. In those cases, developmental art therapy can be particularly helpful because it can help children access and process those early sensory experiences that might be contributing to their current difficulties.
So it's about helping them work through those experiences in a way that makes sense developmentally.
Exactly. And by using art, they can do that in a way that feels safe and manageable.
We've talked a lot about different schools of thought within art therapy, but how about those broader approaches that incorporate various forms of creative expression?
You're talking about expressive arts therapy and multimodal approaches.
Right. What's the core idea behind those?
Well, these approaches recognize that creative expression can take many forms, not just visual art. They might integrate things like movement, music, drama, writing, and even storytelling into the therapeutic process.
So it's about finding the best way for each individual to express themselves creatively, using whatever mediums resonate with them.
Exactly. And the idea is that by tapping into this broader range of expressive modalities, people can connect with their emotions and experiences in a deeper, more holistic way.
So it's not just about what you create, but how you create it and what that process evokes for you emotionally and physically.
Right. And there's this belief that the creative process itself has inherent healing power. It can help people access their imagination, process difficult emotions, and find new ways of being in the world.
So it's about tapping into that innate human capacity for creative expression as a way to promote healing and growth.
Huh?
It sounds like there's a lot of overlap between expressive arts therapy and these other theoretical approaches we've talked about. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. It's not like these approaches are mutually exclusive. They often complement each other. For example, you might use a humanistic approach within the context of expressive arts therapy, or you might incorporate elements of cognitive behavioral therapy into a drama therapy session. It really depends on the needs of the client and the therapist's training and experience.
So it's about being flexible and using the tools that are most effective for each individual.
Right. It's all about tailoring the approach to the person.
Now, one question that I'm sure a lot of people have about art therapy is the whole issue of interpretation. Can you just look at someone's artwork and know what's going on with them? Does it like a psychological X-ray?
That's a great question, and it's one that comes up a lot. The short answer is it's definitely more nuanced than that. While art therapists are certainly interested in what the art might communicate, it's not about simple interpretation.
Right. It's not like there's a secret decoder ring for artwork.
Exactly. Context is key. And the context includes the person's history, their current situation, what they're going through in therapy, and most importantly, what they say about the art themselves. We have to remember that the artist is the ultimate authority on their own work.
So it's about understanding the art within the context of the person's life and their therapeutic journey.
Right. And it's a collaborative process. It's not about the therapist imposing their own interpretations on the client. It's about working together to understand what the art might be revealing and what it means for the person who created it.
So it's more of a dialogue than a diagnosis.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that people are often aware, at least to some degree, of what their art might suggest to others. So their creations may reflect their own attempts to communicate something, rather than purely unconscious processes.
So the artist has a degree of intentionality in their work, even if it's not always fully conscious. The handbook mentioned that projective drawings, like the draw a person test or the house tree person test, have been really popular over the years. But they also pointed out that the scientific evidence to back up those interpretations, whether those tests are actually accurate, is pretty limited.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those projective tests have been around for a long time and they're still widely used. But as with any psychological assessment, it's important to be critical of the research and to use those tools responsibly.
I see. So it's not about throwing those tests out entirely, but about using them with caution and understanding their limitations.
Right. And it's about not over-interpreting the results. Just because someone draws a tiny person, for example, doesn't necessarily mean they have low self-esteem. There could be a million other reasons why they made that choice.
So, again, context is key.
Always.
The handbook actually talked about something called illusory correlation, which I found really fascinating. It's basically this tendency we have to see relationships between things that might not actually be there.
It's like when you're looking for a specific car and suddenly you see that car everywhere.
Right. It's not like there's suddenly more of those cars on the road. You're just noticing them more because you're primed to see them.
Exactly. And the same thing can happen with art. We might be looking for certain signs or symbols, and because we're looking for them, we start seeing them everywhere, even when they might not be there or might not have the meaning we think they do.
The handbook cited a really interesting study by Chapman and Chapman, where they showed students drawings and descriptions of supposed psychological problems.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
And what they found was that the students started perceiving relationships between the drawings and the descriptions that weren't actually there.
Right. They were making connections based on their own biases and expectations, not on any real evidence.
So it's like our minds are wired to look for patterns and make connections, even if those connections aren't real.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of those biases when we're interpreting art, especially in a therapeutic setting.
So it sounds like the whole idea that art is a direct window into the unconscious, that projective hypothesis, isn't really supported by the research.
Right. It's more complicated than that. And while there might be some validity to certain interpretations, it's important to be cautious and to consider all the factors involved.
So what's the takeaway here? If we can't just rely on those classic interpretations, how should we be approaching art in therapy?
Well, what the research suggests is that global ratings of drawings tend to be more valid than trying to interpret specific signs. So instead of focusing on, say, the size of the eyes or the presence of teeth, it's more helpful to look at the overall impression that the drawing creates.
Okay, so you're talking about things like the overall mood or feeling of the piece, the use of color and space, and the way that different elements are organized.
Exactly. And this is where the therapist's clinical judgment comes in. They can use their training and experience to make sense of those global qualities in light of what they know about the client.
The handbook had a pretty compelling example of how this can work in practice. They talked about a case where a therapist noticed some unusual elements in a young man's drawing.
I'm curious, what kind of elements are we talking about here?
Well, the therapist noted the colors he used, the amount of detail, the somewhat strange way the drawing was structured, and this dark cloud that seemed to be moving towards the main figure. And based on this overall impression, the therapist correctly suspected that the young man might have both bipolar disorder and an issue with alcohol.
Wow, so in that case, it was the overall picture that was more informative than any specific detail.
Exactly. It was the convergence of all those elements that tipped the therapist off, not any one thing in isolation.
And that's really interesting because it highlights how art can sometimes reveal things that the person themselves might not even be consciously aware of.
Right. It's like their subconscious is communicating through the art in a way that they might not be able to express verbally.
Yes.
Now, even though global ratings seem to be more reliable, it's still important to be aware of the limitations. The handbook mentioned that even assessments that look at the overall picture, like the kinetic family drawing, don't always tell the whole story.
Right, the kinetic family drawing, or KFD, is where people are asked to draw their family doing something together.
Yeah, and the idea is that how close people draw themselves to each other is supposed to reflect how close they feel emotionally.
But the research has shown that it's not always that straightforward.
Right. The handbook mentioned an example of a woman who drew herself very close to her siblings in the drawing, but actually felt much closer to her mother in real life.
Oh, that's interesting.
And she was also keeping a big secret about her love life that wasn't represented in the drawing at all. So clearly there was more going on beneath the surface than the drawing alone could reveal.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for the therapist to use art-based assessments as a starting point for conversation, not as a definitive diagnostic tool.
Right. The art is a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges of interpreting artwork, but I'm also curious about the more structured art-based assessment tools that are used in art therapy. Can you tell me more about those?
Yeah, there are a number of specific assessment tools that art therapists use, and these tools often focus on more objective, measurable aspects of the artwork.
So instead of trying to decipher hidden meanings. They're looking at more concrete qualities of the art.
Right. And this can be really helpful for tracking progress in therapy, comparing a client's work over time, or even for research purposes.
So what are some examples of these more structured art-based assessment tools?
One that's widely used is the Formal Elements Art Therapy Scale, or FEATS. This scale looks at things like how someone uses color, how they use the space on the page, the sense of energy in the drawing, and how all the different parts of the drawing work together, what we call integration.
So it's about breaking the drawing down into those core elements and analyzing them systematically.
Right. And the nice thing about FEATS is that it's pretty objective. It's not based on the therapist's subjective interpretation of what the drawing means. It's based on observable qualities of the artwork.
So it's more about quantifying those qualities rather than interpreting them.
Exactly. And that can be really helpful for seeing how things are changing over time.
The handbook gave an example of how FEATS was used to track changes in a man named John, who was having electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful example.
They analyzed his a person picking an apple from a tree, drawings, which is called the PPAT, both before and after his ECT treatments. And the FEATS scores showed significant changes.
It's amazing how art can reflect those internal shifts, even when people might not be able to articulate them verbally.
Right.
Another really interesting tool is the Silver Drawing Test of Cognition and Emotion, or SDT.
Tell me more about that one.
Well, the SDT is a bit different from other art-based assessments in that it actually gives people specific drawings to respond to. So instead of just asking them to draw whatever they want, they're given a stimulus drawing and then they're asked to do something with it.
I see. So it's more structured than just free drawing.
Right. And this allows the therapist to assess a range of cognitive skills like spatial reasoning, sequencing, and classification.
So it's tapping into those underlying cognitive abilities.
Exactly. And it can also reveal a lot about the person's emotional state, their self-image, and their ability to regulate their emotions.
Well, it's a pretty versatile assessment tool.
Yeah, it is. And it's been developed and normed across different age groups, which is important for making sure that the results are accurate and reliable.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all test. It takes into account the developmental differences between children, adolescents, and adults.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the PP earlier, the draw a person picking an apple from a tree test. Can you tell me more about that one?
Sure. The PPAT is actually a pretty simple assessment, which is part of what makes it so useful. The instructions are straightforward. Just draw a person picking an apple from a tree. But because everyone is drawing the same basic thing, researchers can study how different psychological characteristics might influence how people draw it.
So it's a good way to control for individual differences in drawing ability.
Right. And it's been used in a lot of research with different populations, including people with depression, anxiety, trauma, and even physical illnesses.
So it's a pretty widely used and well-researched tool.
Yeah, it is. And it's also the assessment that the FEATS rating scale we talked about earlier was specifically developed for.
So you can use FEATS to analyze those PPAT drawings in a more objective and quantifiable way.
Exactly.
Finally, we have the Mandala Assessment Research Instrument, or MRI. What can you tell me about that one?
The MRI is a really fascinating tool, and it's based on Jungian psychology and the work of Joan Kellogg, who was a pioneer in mandala research.
Okay, so this one's getting into some deeper psychological territory.
Right. Jung saw the mandala, which is basically a circular design, as a symbol of the self, of wholeness and integration. And Kellogg developed a system for understanding the different stages of psychological growth that are represented by different mandala shapes.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like the mandala becomes a visual representation of the person's inner journey.
Exactly. And in the MRI, people are first asked to choose cards with different mandala images on them, and then they create their own mandala drawing.
So it's a combination of selecting existing images and creating your own.
Right. And this process can reveal a lot about the person's current psychological state, their strengths, their challenges, and their potential for growth.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with these art-based assessment tools. It sounds like there's a whole range of options, from those that focus on very specific skills to those that explore deeper psychological themes.
Right. And it's important to remember that all of these tools are just that, tools. They're not meant to be used in isolation, and they should always be interpreted in light of the individual's unique circumstances.
So it's about using these tools in a thoughtful and ethical way as part of a larger therapeutic process.
Exactly.
Now let's move on to how art therapy is used in practice. We've got a lot to cover here, but let's start by looking at how it's used with children and adolescents.
Okay, sounds good. Working with young people is a really common application of art therapy, and for good reason. Kids often express themselves much more freely through art than they do through words.
Right. Drawing and playing can be so natural for them.
Exactly. And because their verbal skills might not be as developed as adults, art can provide a really valuable outlet for their feelings and experiences, especially when those experiences are difficult or traumatic.
So it's like art becomes their language, a way for them to communicate what they might not be able to say with words.
That's a great way to put it. And art therapy can be used with children for a wide range of issues, including anxiety, depression, trauma, behavioral problems, and even just the normal stresses of growing up.
The handbook talked about some really simple but effective drawing and storytelling techniques that are often used with children.
Yeah, I love those, like the egg drawing and the cave drawing.
Those are the ones. Can you remind us what those are all about?
Sure. In the egg drawing, the therapist simply gives the child an oval shape, like an egg, and asks them to create a picture inside the egg and then tell a story about it. And in the cave drawing, it's the same idea, but with a cave shape instead of an egg.
And what's the idea behind those simple prompts? What do they reveal about the child?
Well, they can be really effective in stimulating the child's imagination and encouraging them to express themselves creatively. And because the prompts are so open-ended, the child has a lot of freedom to project their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences onto.